Hey, welcome to the Trinity Podcast. My name is Joel Milligan. I've got Daniel Riddick, Tommy Carr, and Tom Messer here with us today. As you notice, we are on location. Again, there's so many things happening around here at Trinity. I think there's band practice happening to prepare for a band concert at the end of the year. So I thought it'd be cool if we actually did it with the band behind us.
That would be incredible.
Like playing.
That would be awesome.
But no, they didn't. They didn't agree with that. But thank you for joining us on the podcast. If this is your first time with us, we would love for you to subscribe and be a part of our podcast that launches at 7 a.m. every Tuesday. And what we're going to do today is we are kicking off a new series in our church called Table Talk. It's going to be all about tackling the tough conversations that we have with our kids and with our families. And we try to do something like this every year. But since we're talking about table talk, what was your family like growing up at a young age, elementary, middle school, high school? Was the family dinner a thing? Do you remember having conversations around the dinner table, or was there a certain restaurant you would always go to? Daniel, I'll start with you. What was that like in your household?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely wasn't never, but we were not a gather around the dinner table every night. Mm-hmm. And so we kind of, all did our own thing. And so I would say a lot of those, what you look back on and go important conversations or significant conversations, they weren't necessarily dinner table conversations. Right. For us. We had a little bit of a commute to school. And so a lot of times it'd be kind of the time in the car or, depending on what was going on. But yeah, we were not a gather around the dinner table.
For me, it was every Wednesday night, my parents would take us to Shoney's.
Oh, yeah.
Shoney's.
And in fact, in Indiana, it was a Shoney's, but then it was a Frisch's Big Boy is what it was called. It was this buffet that I think we ate for like $4.99 or something. But I remember every Wednesday night we would be at Frisch's Big Boys eating a buffet and talking about a little bit of everything. That's something I specifically remember. Tell me about you.
Yeah, every night between 5:30 and 6, it was an appointment. You did not miss family dinner.
Okay.
Monday through Friday, you were going to be at the dinner table from 5:30 to 6 window. The whole family was there unless my dad was working night shift. And there were conversations. Some nights there would be a television on. We would be discussing whatever was on the television. And so it was a very close family gathering. And in my family growing up, it was an appointment. I read a book years ago, The Most Important Place on Earth. And they actually called it the sacred desk of the home, where that is where life is undone. So for our family, that's what it was. It was a sacred appointment. If we ever went out, here's a crazy thing. There was a number of places we went, but for some reason, I remember Jimmy's buttermilk chicken.
On Normandy.
Jimmy's buttermilk chicken on Normandy, the cream peas, the chicken. Yeah, so that was it.
That was probably a lot more common, though, back in the early 1900s when you were growing up.
Here he goes. See, last week on the political, they asked Tom. Last week they asked on the politically incorrect one we did, do you remember your first presidential election? And I said, yeah, Woodrow Wilson. So, yeah, back then it was more popular for us Amish people to go out to Jimmy's buttermilk chicken.
Well, you had to get it all in before sundown.
It's just there's age shaming going on this direction. So,
Pastor, what
get
was
him,
like
Tom.
for you?
Get him, Tom.
So a couple things. My dad turns 100 in a month.
Me too.
We're gonna go. So I'm gonna be at home, celebrate that with him, and he was a depression kid. The depression hit early 30s, and so he'd been 7, 8 years old. So, and my mom comes from a family of cooks. That's a big deal. So meals were very important, and literally, and I don't say this as a negative. I don't know that we ate out in a restaurant
Growing up at all.
I mean, here's my memories. We went to a Red Sox game almost every year, and it was a big deal, not because we just went to a Red Sox game, but because we would always go to a restaurant. And that's not something we did as kids. Now, that doesn't mean we didn't go to like a fast food place or something, but it was not a part of our routine. So
and you have to plan those out when you're on horse and buggy.
Yeah.
You just can't.
yeah. So the early when my brothers and I were younger, excuse me, family dinner was like what Tommy described. It was an appointment. It was an ordeal. You did not. There was never a time you did not sit down and do it. Mm-hmm. Now, as we get older and our schedules are more scattered, and in sports became a big part. It was a little more culture. I grew up in a family of 4 boys. We're all 16 months apart virtually. And I can assure you there were not the deep conversations were typically about whatever we had done wrong leading up to that moment and what the agenda was for controlling. My dad was he was authoritative. He was not harsh by any means. He's very, very gentle and loving but he was disciplined, very disciplined and regimented, and he very focused on this would be a normal thing. At dinner, he's going to tell you what the night's going to look like. Like, is your homework done? Mm-hmm. If it's not, you have to do that. If it is, you can go outside, and then he'd tell you a time. And then it was, you're going to take a bath. You can watch one show on TV. Like he might say you can have an hour of TV.
Oh, yeah.
Or you can read for 2 hours.
That's it.
Well, I became a reader.
Yeah, because you want to stay up.
I want to stay up longer, And at the time, I didn't think, oh, he's smart. I just thought, man, he takes all the fun out of life. But we I like Daniel and Tommy, deep conversations were not typically had in group context. They were individual.
Yeah. So regardless of where those conversations took place, we're going to, in this series at our church, we're going to tackle a couple of different important questions and hopefully give biblical insight. Some of the questions relate to how do I make friends? So having healthy biblical friendships. Another week, we're going to talk about who puts you in charge, a conversation of authority, significance of biblical parenting. And then we're also going to have an important conversation about talking to your kids about sexuality and what the Bible has to say about that. But today, what I would like to talk about on the podcast is we're going to look at the importance of a faith-filled home and a generational transfer of faith. Basically, you could say it this way. Our kids may look at us and say, why should I believe what you believe? Why should I believe what you believe? And I think a great setting for this as we talk about it is the book of Proverbs. In fact, Proverbs is really built around a parent sharing God's wisdom with their child. And it talks about the significance of the home. In fact, you can read this in Proverbs. It says, when I was a son with my father, tender, the only one in the sight of my mother, and he taught me and said to me, let your heart hold fast my words and keep my commandments and live. So let's kind of jump into that conversation, and I'll start with this question. Anyone can take a stab at this, or all three of you. I'm a parent, what is the principal thing that I should focus on for my children? What is the principal thing that I should focus on for my children?
Well, giving your children wisdom.
Yeah.
Wisdom.
Yeah. I mean, Proverbs 4:7, wisdom is a principal thing, right? So if we're going to get anything into our kids, and wisdom there is in Proverbs is really, it's kind of a fascinating. Obviously, we taught on it already, but the ultimate wisdom is Jesus, right? Proverbs 8. He's a personification of wisdom. Wisdom is it's a collection of wisdom that allows you to look at life from God's point of view, that gives you competency to deal with all the difficult issues that you have in life, and every child's going to go through them. And if you only prepare your child outwardly with things, with toys, with riches, with whatever that is, but you don't prepare them inwardly with a relationship with Jesus, they're not going to be equipped to deal with life when it's inevitably going to throw them difficulty. And the whole thing of Proverbs 4 is such a great chapter. Is emphasis on wisdom, emphasis on the father-son relationship, parent teaching that wisdom to their children, pouring it into them. But then it talks a lot about the heart, right? And the heart is it is the control center of the life, right? Everything flows out of the heart. Proverbs 4:23, for out of the heart, keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it flow all the issues of life. And so getting wisdom on the inside of your life is what is going to have the greatest impact on the outside of your life.
It's so easy, I feel like, and why I think the conversation is so important is because I feel like parenting, and maybe just the home, go broad, it is one of the unusually, it's difficult to sometimes, what I would say, keep the principal thing or the main thing in the home. And it's interesting if you contrast it with like, say, our jobs or our work experience. For most of the people listening, you go to work and you've got a real clear-cut task to do. You have a responsibility. You've got a goal. If you work for, especially if you work for any kind of national level company or something like that, the objectives and the bottom line and the profits are so, precise, and they're so, clear. And then, you get into the arena of parenting and the home and the family, and I don't think it's unclear. And I think most Christian people would kind of nod along with everything Pastor Tom is saying. Yet that arena, it becomes incredibly difficult not to become distracted with things that might even be important, but they're certainly lesser. And just the nature of, the challenge of child, kind of rearing, the schedules, all of the pulls of life, the influences. And maybe unlike we find ourselves in a job where we just know what we're supposed to do and we do it, and then we clock out. In the arena of the home, it is so easy to lose sight of we're doing everything except maybe the principal thing. And I just feel like this conversation is critically important for parents and grandparents and anybody who has influence over the next generation.
Yeah, I love the idea of that, the principal thing. That's what the scripture really speaks to. And that word means it's the chiefest, it's the best, it's the first. Almost an idea of a first fruit. This is the first thing you impart to them. You see it early in Scripture when he's saying, teach these things to your children. They would bind them around their arms, put them in phylacteries where the Scriptures are part of their life. And so I think it requires a definition when we say, hey, give your kids wisdom. That doesn't just mean make them smart. It doesn't mean get them in the books. It means teaching them to see life from God's point of view.
Right.
Teaching them to see life from God's perspective. So when your kid comes home from elementary school and said, the world's coming to an end. No, here's what God says about this.
Yeah.
My friends called me this name. That's not true because you're fearfully and wonderfully made. And so I think the idea is, here's Solomon saying, my dad taught me these things. Now, Solomon veered off on occasion. But Solomon's saying, here's what's really important for you. Teach these things to your children. Teach them to see life from God's perspective.
We're talking about a biblical perspective on parenting, but I would love to hear kind of your definition to two other types of parenting. The first one is, if someone were to say a moralistic type of parenting, what does that look like, and what's the danger of having that type of parenting?
It's when you make everything about rules and performance. And when a parent does that, there's probably a lot of motivations, but at the heart of that is typically we get our identity from how our kids behave. So we're more concerned about our kids performing outwardly because of the way it reflects on us. And then we're just trying to control behavior, not transform character. And, behavior is one thing, character is another. If you get your kids to have the right kind of character, their behavior is going to be what you want it to be. If you only focus on behavior, then you're always in behavior modification mode, not character, heart transformation mode.
Yeah.
This is assuming the majority of the people listening to us or watching us today are religious people.
Right.
I think that's a fair assumption. This usually is the trap of religious parents, which is we do understand and have a good concept that the Bible does have a moral code.
Sure.
And there is a morality and an ethic, rightfully, all throughout the pages of Scripture. What we lose sight of, even if unintentionally in our parenting, is the heart through which that moral code or that ethic is birthed. And candidly, I mean, just, to be really honest, it's a lot easier for me to make my son or daughter do something than it is to get them to want to do the right thing. And we usually start to, because we're tired and because parenting's hard, and we kind of default to where, I'm going to take the path of least resistance, which is I'm going to force them to do right. And if they're generally compliant kids, they do a pretty good job about that. It's interesting. We kind of know this breaks down. I mean, not every time, but we kind of know it breaks down. And to use kind of an extreme example, if you watch the news or you read a story about someone who's done something terrible or tragic, they've made a terrible decision, they've committed some crime. You watch an interview with a parent or with a friend or with a neighbor, you know what they say every single time? I can't believe this. They were such a good person.
Yep.
And I use that as just a simple anecdote to make the point that just moral conformity does not guarantee or ultimately result in transformation and real character. And it's a part of parenting, but that has got to come from something else.
So I've got 3 grown children. So basic needs of every person, Tom, myself, you, every one of us. As you get older, it probably gets below the surface a little bit, but attention, appreciation, and acceptance. Those are the 3 basic needs of people. Attention, acceptance, appreciation, especially in formative years of children. So the moral code breaks down, in my opinion, when their acceptance is based upon how they behave. The way you appreciate is based on how they behave. The attention you give them is based on how they behave. And all of a sudden, a kid gets his value from how he's behaving, not for who he is. So every kid is going to let you down morally at some point. I don't care how good of a kid they are. I mean, we had Felicia Perry on the podcast a year ago, and she goes, I was a rebellious teenager. I went, what? I mean, so Christopher, I think I've shared this years ago, Christopher, during one of the basketball games, he just got frustrated. And in front of hundreds of people in the gymnasium, he just blurted out a curse word. And it wasn't a light curse word. It was a heavy curse word. And Rhoda just went, I have never been so embarrassed in my life. And so I think, and we corrected it. We talked to him about, listen, we don't love you less. We don't think any different. You're not accepted differently. You're not appreciated. You're not, none of those things, the attention we give you. And so I think when you attach morality to the way you do it, Daniel's right. It breaks down at some point it's going to fall apart on you if you're not really careful.
So Proverbs talks about the path of wisdom and the wrong path, and our goal is to get our kids on the path of wisdom. But if my child, am I able to get them on the path of wisdom, does that mean smooth sailing for them? If I can get them on that path, does it mean smooth sailing? And obviously I know the answer to this question, but why is that not the case?
Well, here's so you have this, I don't want to get too deep on this, but you have the way that life is supposed to work and the way that it actually works. The way life is supposed to work is God's design in creation was for a world without sin and a world without brokenness. And so because of that, it's inevitable that every single person, including and in many respects, especially people who are believers, are going to go through hard things. All that live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. There's no such thing as a trouble-free, problem-free life, okay? But the other part of that is it's also true that you can make life harder for you by the choices that you make, right? So Proverbs also says the way of the transgressor is hard. And the idea there is not just, good people have easy lives, bad people have bad lives. Good and bad people have difficulties that they're going to face in life.
Sure.
you don't have to create self-inflicted wounds, and you don't have to make life more difficult than it is for yourself. So, the metaphor, and you got to remember that these are metaphors that are intended to prove to make a principle, not necessarily prove a point. And the principle is this: that the righteous have more light, and the righteous have the capacity to be more sure-footed. That's a normal description about paths, right? Judgment is a noonday path. My feet will be smooth, right? And all the ways go, he shall direct that path. Your path will be better. And then, an unrighteous person or an unbelieving person, the way of the transgressor's heart, his path is going to be filled with darkness. His path is going to have potholes in it. He's going to be more apt to stumble, because the paths, in essence, may be equally difficult. One is more equipped to walk the path than the other is equipped to walk the path. And so the important thing about parenting is not so much that you're guaranteeing your child a successful life or a problem-free life. It's that you're equipping them to deal with whatever life throws at them, and life is inevitably going to throw hard things at them.
I think there's a practical reality as well that is, as parents and as we have influence within our homes, that we fundamentally believe both theologically, cosmically, spiritually, but then also practically, that at the end of the day, and it doesn't mean perfect, smooth, without problem, but that living life God's way is the best way. And I can't remember who said this, but somebody was making a case, and they kind of began to address maybe religious or faith skeptics in the audience. And they said, this is not a primary apologetic, or, I can convince you or talk about other reasons why what I'm saying and teaching you about Jesus and the Bible is true. But one of the great apologetics is it's just a better way to live. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a reality that if we're not communicating that reality to our kids or to our grandkids, hey, that not only is this just a neat idea or not, it's like this is God's best. And when you live life, keep going back to wisdom, God's way, the principal point is not that it will be perfect, but that it is the preferred way to live. And you end up, and that's the other thing, we're not honest, I think, a lot of times about the reality of our suffering. And we've just talked recently over the last number of months in our church about this. Yeah. The truth is we live in a broken, sinful world, and sometimes we are the recipients of suffering and brokenness because of other people's decisions or because of the reality of sin. Some tragic accident, some diagnosis, we're the recipient. We didn't contribute to it. The hard part of this is that the reality is that a huge part of our suffering is not something that we're just kind of sovereignly receiving. It's something that we have contributed to and participated in. And that's the piece, I love what Pastor Tom said, that's the piece where wisdom and faith steer our kids around so much unnecessary and unneeded self-inflicted heartache. And it has the potential not to keep their life problem free, but to transform the quantity of problem that they might experience otherwise.
Yeah, I love what you both said about that. It's amazing. I love what you said about the lighting on the path. Wisdom tells you what path to be on. It tells you to stay off of this path. It keeps you off the other path. There's an Old English word that for the ones that are the wicked, there's a straightening. And I went and did the word study, and it's like it actually gets narrow. When you're on the wicked path, life becomes more difficult. It becomes harder. You become trapped in whatever vices you have. Right. And it gets more and more narrow. It's almost like, hey, if you're involved with an improper person, it's a ditch. It's a ditch you're in. It narrows you into. And the life he's talking about, this godly wisdom, is actually a free life. It's an open life. It's a great life. And I think the way we teach our kids that is really important. So, quick example, and I won't be long with this one. So, when the boys were in high school, you'll know it's not Crystal based on the illustration. Boys are in high school. They said, hey, we want to go to this party. Well, natural parents no, don't even give them a reason. And they go, well, why? Because I said so. And Rhoda and I realized really quickly that was a bad way for us to parent. No, because I said so. I'm in charge. Like, we're going to do a series on who put you in charge.
Who put you in charge?
So what we started doing is navigating through that with them. So I'd go, okay, so you want to go to the party? Tell me who's going to be there. So they would go all the way through here, and then they go, and this guy's going to be there. I went, oh. I said, so what do you think he might bring? He go, probably some drugs, maybe some underage alcohol drinking. I said, ooh, what do you think would happen from there? He goes, well, I guess somebody could call the police. And what happens if the police show up and they go, I guess we could get arrested. And I went, ooh. I said, what do you think about jail? They said, I don't think we should go to the party. I'm like, okay, so we just navigated you down and gave you some godly wisdom on, there's so many, every question had a proverb to it. Don't do this with this kind of person. Don't get caught in this situation. To where now you're imparting godly wisdom to your kids that equips them to make a decision in life.
I will tell you this too, and I'm, of everybody here, I'm probably the youngest in my
Goes again.
I'm along no I was going to say in my parenting experience. My kids are in middle school and high school, and so there's a lot of this I'm living or figuring out. But one of the things you quickly realize is there's parts of wisdom that you have to impart to your kids to protect them and those kinds of things.
Sure.
And then there's a lot of it that they just fundamentally don't know unless you teach them.
Right.
They don't realize they even need the truth of God. And I'll share a quick kind of party story as well. So Braden's in high school, and this wasn't that long ago, and he was going to a party. I think it was a birthday party or something with some friends. I didn't know anybody there, and and so I'm driving him there, and I didn't really have deep concerns, but I was just like, hey, I don't know what's going on here. And I asked him some questions. I felt okay with him going. But on the way there, I was like, this seems like the right time to tee up a dad speech.
Yes.
And so I kind of said, hey, look, I know this is probably not going to be a big deal, but listen, if somebody brings out alcohol, we're not doing that. If drugs, weed, I said, let's just, and he looks at me just like, I can't believe you're telling me this right now. This is crazy. This is not happening. You didn't have to tell me this is not going to happen, And I said, okay, cool. Sounds good. Yeah. I pick him up. He gets in the car and he's like, man, you're not going to believe this, And I was like, what happened? He said, and it wasn't any of the kids that were there, but some of the family members that were there. They brought out this big hookah pipe, and they're kind of as a family. And he said the whole time they're setting this thing up, he was thinking, Dad was right. Everything he was saying is actually happening.
Right.
And my point is that sometimes we have to teach kids because they do not know. They're not going to come to these conclusions on their own without instruction. Mm-hmm. And it's critical.
Yeah, very.
So, and I really felt good when he said
you felt good. You're like, Dad.
So smart, didn't you?
For a moment.
Well, to piggyback off of that, my next question was, when does wisdom become real to our children, and what does that look like? And there's two ways that Proverbs talks about that faith is taught in words, and then faith is also caught by our example. So if we could go around the tables here and maybe share something that your dad taught you in words, and then taught you not in word, but maybe by example. And then let's talk a little bit about why that is so important when it comes to us as parents. Faith is taught in words, and it's taught by example. Share a little bit about your fathers and that experience.
Well, so my dad, again, he's going to turn 100 next month. So I have a long history with him, obviously. I'm really fortunate to have him still alive. This is what I would tell you about my dad. He, in many ways, you'd say he's a man of few words. He was not a big talker. His whole kind of underlying principle in life was this, that your words and your behavior have to match up. And he would call it character. It's probably integrity, but so he would do two things. You don't talk your way out of something. You behave your way into. You behave your way out of it. And whatever you say, you do. You make a promise, you keep your promise. If you give somebody your word, you keep your word. And that, I know that, again, that you can take a very moralistic view about that. You eventually become fully aware that the only way you're going to do that is through through a relationship with Jesus. He has to empower you to become the kind of person that you would not be apart from him. And so, I'll give you just one example. I don't talk about this a lot, but when I was big for my age and was successful in athletics when I was even little. I mean, when I was in the 7th and 8th grade, I just practiced with the varsity football. I didn't hit with them, but I was and it was pretty obvious I was going to play very young. And back then you couldn't technically play for the varsity when you were in junior high. But my dad was a coach. He was athletic director at high school. I played with him. And so when we got to football, and when I was a freshman, I played quarterback on the football team, started in basketball on the basketball team. And the baseball coach at the time said, and some of it was probably there was an arrogance about me, and, coaches can be coaches. And, he just said, there's no way you're going to play varsity baseball as a 9th grader. And I probably was good enough to, and I kind of was like, okay, so I'll go out for track. Because the track coach said, you can run in all the meets and you can do all this stuff. So I went out for track. And I mean, after 2 days of track, I'm like, I'm going back to baseball.
Yeah.
This is running. And my dad goes, no, you're not. I'm like, no, yes, I am. He goes, no, you're not. He said, you made a commitment, you're going to keep it. And I said, but it's miserable. I said, these people are crazy. I said, it's the stupidest thing in the whole world that people want to run around in a circle for hours. He says, you're going to do it. And he said, and this is my dad. I mean, he checked every single day
That you were at.
And there was no injuries. There was no faking it. There was no, he was to the point, you're not going to get detention on purpose. You're not,
Yeah.
I can make it so that and I'm telling you, that cured me. I've never been a runner, never want to be a runner. But his whole deal was, if you give your word, you're going to keep it.
Yeah.
Yeah, similar. You knew my dad. My dad,
Yeah.
he passed away 20 years ago this month, or last month in April. And so he was probably like Tom's a little bit, a man of fewer words, special operations guy in the Army, worked on the railroad for 30 years. So when he said something, you kind of just got quiet and listened. And that's what it was. Mom was a really primary influence in my life as well, still is. But Dad, when he'd say stuff, he'd have these ways of saying it for me. Probably when I was in elementary school, maybe junior high school, I was walking, he was picking me up from school, and I walked straight across just out here. Got in the car and he goes, what are you doing? I said, what do you mean? He goes, character walks on the sidewalk. What do you mean? He goes, isn't there a rule not to walk on the grass? I said, yeah. He goes, character walks on the sidewalk. He goes, it's a great lesson in life. So one night I was saying, I need to tell you something. He goes, you'll find out nothing sleeps on your pillow like a clean conscience. So there were just these little, little lifelong lessons of, I would just say a really primary influence of life lesson. Then he taught me a really great lesson on how to treat females. Like I never saw a man treat a female like he treated my mom. And so the first time I took her out on a single date, he goes, I want to tell you something. He goes, if you're confronted, if you're accosted, if somebody tries to, rob y'all, or if you're confronted, he goes, she comes home, you don't. And that was just the way he was. Like
Well, that's special ops mentality.
I know. She comes home, you don't. And so there were just these real bullet point life lessons. Yeah. And so if I would ever disappoint him, which he would not get really mad. I mean, you talk about track, it made me think, I ran track my junior year. Ran 330 hurdles, high jumped and long jumped. And we don't have a track. We're going to work on that. So we had to run from here to Stillwell.
Oh, wow.
And about a mile away. And the track coach.
100-degree heat.
Yeah, it was burning up. So I'm like, I'm not a distance runner. So I just found a person in our high school that could pick me up at the front gate. Get in her car. We would drive around for a little bit. I'd go to the Jiffy store, pick up some lemon heads. She'd drop me off on Burma Road. I would run down Burma Road to Stillwell. And we get to our first track meet. And he goes, we need some more points. We need somebody to run the mile. He goes, Tommy, you're the freshest guy that we have on the track team when you get to Stillwell. We want you to run the mile. And I told him, I said, the next mile I run will be my first mile that I run. So I got home. I said, Dad, he goes, character walks on the sidewalk. And so, just those life lessons.
Yeah, no, that's
How about
good.
you, Dan?
Yeah, same thing. I mean, I would say by and large, and I think this is the way it should be, and this is the principle that you see in Proverbs, is that, we're going to consistently teach things, but most of what our kids are going to learn from us are going to be what they observe.
Yeah.
And it was absolutely that way with my dad, and I could point to a handful of what I would just call realities of the way he lives his life. He was a great dad. He was a really good husband. He was a hard, worked really hard. I mean, really invested in his work and in his career. My dad, got sick and passed at the end of his life, and it's like it's an odd thing to say, but it's like I've looked at him and I've always thought, I had a unusual example early on to go, well, that's what it looks like to model faith out in a really difficult time of suffering.
Yeah.
And I do think just in general, I could keep going, but that is the point, is that we're going to say a lot of stuff to our kids, and that's important. We got to teach them. They don't know it. They need to hear it. Probably double the impact is what they're going to see from us. And in that passage that we taught on in this last week, there's this really great phrase that the writer is saying to his child, and he says, listen to the words that I say, and then the next verse says, and when you see them.
Yeah.
So in other words, it's both of those. Listen to what I'm saying, and when you see my words, I'm gonna say it to you, and then you're gonna watch me.
Yeah.
You're gonna see it in front of you, and that's when it gets real.
Yeah.
And kids know it. I mean,
They do.
we've all parented long enough to know. I mean, man, kids can sniff out inauthentic living, not just in their parents, but everywhere, a mile away.
So I'd say for my dad, very similar. He coached all of my life as long as I can remember. He's retired now. And I felt I always played for him, and he was always harder on me than any of the other players. The players wouldn't believe me, but I promise you he was. But one of the things I remember that he taught me, not through word, but by example, was I remember, of course, we're in Indiana. Every basketball's huge in Indiana. Yeah. It was the night before a huge rivalry game. I don't think we had lost in our gym in like the past 3 seasons. It was like this incredible homestand where we were undefeated. And I remember him dismissing practice. All the guys got ready and left, but we didn't leave. And I'm like, Dad, are we going home? He's like, son, it's a big game tomorrow. I really need to mop this floor. I need to clean the gym floor. We need to get it ready for the big game. And I remember sitting there and seeing him pull out the mop bucket, the coach of the basketball team, head coach, huge game coming up tomorrow, and he was mopping the gym floor before the game. And it was an example, so many things my dad taught me, but it was an example of you give your absolute best at whatever you are supposed to do, whether it's coaching on the Friday night, huge rivalry game, or mopping the floor Thursday night before the game. Right. He gave his absolute best. And I've never forgotten that visual picture of giving your absolute best at everything that you do, which I believe is a biblical example as well. So Proverbs does talk about 3 key areas that can be indicators of how we handle wisdom, not just for kids, but for parents. And I would love your feedback on this. Talks about mouth, eyes, and feet. How are those indicators of how our kids use wisdom, how we believe wisdom affects our eyes, the mouth, the eyes, and the feet?
So your heart, out of the heart flows the issues of life. What is in your heart becomes the controlling mechanism of how you live things out. So, Jesus said, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks, right? Proverbs, your heart connected to your mouth. So the mouth, the ability to control your mouth with with the inner structure, the inner content of your heart, that's self-control. The eyes, that's discernment, how you see life. The way, there's a lot of ways to see life, but you see it through the lens of God's wisdom. So you got self-control, discernment, and then character, where you go with your feet. What path are you going to turn to? How are you going to choose? So in the life of your children, see, the goal is not that your children behave in a way that makes you feel good or behave in a way that,
Doesn't embarrass
gives you
you.
self-worth. It's that you help them build a life where they can exhibit self-control, they have discernment, and they have character. And if you want your kids to be equipped to handle whatever life's going to throw at them, a heart that's filled with the wisdom of God will manifest itself with self-control, discernment, and character. And that's when your kids will do what they're supposed to do, not because you're there or not because you tell them or not because they fear consequences, but because they are living out what is truth that has become real in their life. That doesn't mean kids are perfect. Kids are going to make mistakes. But if they make mistakes with the wisdom of God in their heart, they also are equipped to correct those. So, James chapter 3, words matter, right? Control your tongue, you control your life, right? That's self-control. The way you see things, right? The temptation of the lust of the eyes. If you don't have discernment, your eyes will be distracted by what the world has to offer. And then feet, wherever you're, that little song, be careful, little
Feet where
Feet
you go.
where
feet
you
where
go.
you go, right? And so all of that is really what you're driving at in parenting. And I'll say this so that it expands a little bit. That's true about grandparenting. My time with my grandkids is not as intense, obviously, as was with my own children, but it's as impactful and as important. And I'm always thinking about, like, my oldest grandson's a really good athlete, and he has to learn self-control. That's a hard lesson to learn, right? But we have teaching moments to do those. And his dad does a really good job, mom does a really good job doing that. But there are times when I can help reinforce those things. Discernment, teaching moments are helping your kids think through, how do you process that? All my kids have asked me the same question. God created everything. Why is marijuana bad? Right? And my thing
We
is
tackled
not
that on a previous episode.
my thing is not to scare them
Yeah.
about that. My thing is to give them discernment and
Right.
wisdom so they can process that.
Yeah.
And they can own their own convictions about their life.
Thinking back to our last series we did, trying to make a kind of a nuanced connection to it. Some things are taught, some things are caught and seen. So the example of the father in the prodigal son story. So here's a person, a parable. Here's a dad that runs out that could have said anything to a returning prodigal son that could have embarrassed him by his behavior. So here's what he says. He cuts off his preordained speech. And he says, "Oh, my son is home." So he exemplified that his speech was right? He saw life from the right perspective. I'm not going to hammer my child based on his behavior. I'm going to display character in the way I throw a party and also in the way I deal with the older brother. So if you think about, if you play that parable out, which Scripture doesn't do, but let's say the younger son gets older, he would always have the example of his father on how to handle disappointment, bad living on his part. There was a character. So there was a feat ran to him. There was a speech, spoke to him well, character through a party.
Yeah.
The listening and hearing that analogy that's given in Proverbs, that those become our mouth, eyes, and feet. They essentially they reveal the kind of the reality of the heart issue, And so as the wisdom of God is poured in, there's self-control, discernment, and inner character and integrity. But then inevitably, and somebody just said this, our kids are going to make mistakes. Our grandkids are going to make mistakes. And what happens especially when and just to kind of tie back into our earlier conversation, when we're parenting from a place of simply what I would call like a moral code, that, hey, everything's just got to be done the right way on the outside, and we neglect the reality of the heart. What happens when they exhibit a lack of self-control, when they show poor discernment, when they do something that reflects poor character, if we're just living from a moral code standpoint, here's the reaction as parents. I'm angry, I'm embarrassed.
Yeah.
Parents probably don't like to talk about that as much as we should. Half of the reason why we're upset with our kids isn't because at all of what they did. It's because of how it makes us feel. We feel like we're bad parents. And if we don't get past that and realize that, sure, those are wrong things and there may be consequence, there may be discipline, but that God's actually given us an opportunity through their mouth, through their eyes, through their feet, we're getting a window into their heart. When you get into heart parenting, yeah, you may have to deal with the real behavioral consequences of their actions, but what he's given you is an opportunity to go, okay, there's something behind the scenes there that you have you have an opportunity to move into and to speak to and to work on that goes beyond behavior modification.
Yeah.
And so while none of us want our kids to make mistakes, and they're going to, and what we see is that these are the reflections of heart realities, and even in the moments of discipline, we have an opportunity to look and go, okay, God's given me a chance to speak to some real heart issues. And if we can point our correction and our discipline back toward that, eventually in the long run, and I think Pastor Tom, you said it, when they're not with us, they're out of the house and they're doing it on their own, it's going to be the rewired structure of their heart that's going to change the direction of their life.
I think he says that early in Proverbs too. He says, "My son, give me your heart."
Yeah.
There's a heart connection there. He doesn't say, "Give me your behavior." He says, "Give me your heart."
So our whole idea is, why should I believe what you believe? This idea of helping our kids make faith their own and not something that their parents believe or grandparents believe. What is the value in helping our kids? Proverbs talks about this, like crawl, walk, and run when it comes to them making their faith their own. And how has that played out maybe in your kids' lives of crawling, walking, and running and making their faith their own?
Well, so that analogy would talk about spiritual maturity or maybe even physical maturity, but what it speaks of stages, right? Crawling stage, walking stage, running stage. And what you have is, and I think what becomes the goal with your kids is that you have to release control, and if you do, you stunt the maturity of your kids. You have to I always tell people, you try as a parent, find as many ways as you can to say yes. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean everything is an automatic yes. Oftentimes it means yes with conditions, right? Or yes up to this point, or yes with limits, whatever. Mm-hmm. But you want your kids to be able to experience life. And, my kids had friendships. Some were, I'd put high value, really good friendships, and some I would put not ideal. I didn't discourage them from having friendships that were not ideal. I just worked it out so that those friendships were done in a controlled environment where my kids had more influence on them than they had influence on my kids. And what you do is you're doing that so that as they get older, and now they all, my three oldest will, by the end of the summer, they'll all have their own children. It's amazing how they think about parenting so differently, now that they're in the parent role themselves. And I think about parent differently. Because I've learned, and my kids are on me all the time because, my youngest is 21 and my oldest kids think I lost my mind when it came to, I'm like, I learned what I don't have to. I'm not doing the stuff I didn't have to do. I already tried all that on you, and it didn't work.
Wow. I would say this is what helped Rhoda and I in that whole process. So we have 3 children. I would say the impartation, the intake, and the manifestation of wisdom in a kid's life occurs at different times, levels, and seasons for each of our kids. So if you think in the physical way, every kid walks at a different month. Every kid gets potty trained at a different month. They use words at different levels. Not everyone's the same. Like I remember Rhoda and I, one loving family member said, "Hey, is your child potty trained yet?" I'm like, "Well, not yet." They said, "Well, all my kids are potty trained at 8 months." I'm like, "Really?" I said, "Ours aren't." And they're not even close. And so I would say this spiritually, you're giving wisdom out, but sometimes it's taken in by kids. It manifests in their life in different seasons.
Sure.
I had one child that was probably more spiritual at an early age, and wisdom made more sense. Some of the others were a little more distracted. One was a little more hard-headed. And so don't lose faith or hope if that wisdom doesn't manifest itself in a certain season that you're picking. It's just only sanctification, that spiritual process. It's different in every person's life. Give your kids time to intake the wisdom before you see it manifested.
Yeah. Well, speaking of phases and just kind of walking or crawling, walking and running with our kids, let me encourage our listeners before we go today, if you would go to tbc.org/table talk, we're going to have some resources on there. One resource that we handed out this past week that I think is just great, it's how to talk to your kids about faith through the different stages. There's a PDF on there that you can click and download, plus a number of other resources that we will make available as we are in this series of Table Talk. So great conversation today, everybody. Thank you so much for listening to the Trinity Podcast today. As always, you can find us online, YouTube, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or on the Trinity app. We will catch you next time.